Why did American involvement in Vietnam escalate up until 1964? It is most arguable that the escalation of the war from 1950 up until 64 was inevitable, as each president was to inherit what the other had done so before, in particular consideration of the quagmire and stalemate theory. There were the ever-rising domestic pressures faced by each president to prove they were not soft on communism, and led to the Vietnam War accumulating into a Cold War context that it did not entirely understand. In wanting to prove that America was a superpower, they would not stand for the expansion of communism. The policy of containment adopted by Truman had evolved into even a greater thesis, the Domino Theory, established by Eisenhower and inherited even more predominantly by his two successors, Kennedy and Johnson. Each had delved deeper and deeper into the quagmire, literally, a muddy marsh that was metaphorically Vietnam. Perhaps the biggest involvement came about after the assassination of Kennedy. Johnson, his predecessor, was to inherit an ever more influential military Congress who could equally take the blame for increasing involvement in the Vietnam War. Perhaps the most prominent factor was the President Johnson's background that would lead him to take a series of decisions for which he would be made responsible for the deaths of Vietnamese children and large numbers of US troops. The most important factor that led to an increased involvement is conceivable under the policy of containment, first adopted by Truman in 1950, which led the Vietnam War to be misconceived and set in a Cold War context. The US failed to recognize that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist first and a communist second, hoping to drive out French imperial forces and reunite the country under an independent communist government. Each succession of presidents had inherited the policy of containment and ideology that saw communism as the biggest threat to the American security and the rest of the world. Eisenhower would then adopt the domino theory. You have a row of dominoes, you knock one over, and what will happen to the last is certainly that it will go over. Taking the domino thesis literally, Eisenhower could not allow this to become a reality, as the massive defeat at Dien Bien Phu meant that the French were becoming a liability. Consequently, he agreed massive aid to the government of South Vietnam and an escalation of the war. Kennedy, then unlike his predecessor, further inherited a policy of containment in which to prevent communist domination, which led to the initiation of a series of mutually supporting action of military, political and economic and psychological factors, a blueprint for escalation. The policy of containment had caused misinterpretation. Defense spending was increased from $40 billion a year to $56 billion. The US believed to be locked in a worldwide conflict with the Soviet Union, in which revolution was the key chosen Soviet weapon. Ho Chi Minh had received training in Moscow, and his whole regime in North Vietnam had failed to be seen as separate from the worldwide communist conspiracy to subvert Western capitalism and liberal values. Johnson had become a firm believer in the domino theory and inherited members of Congress such as McNamara, the two served Kennedy, and had every intention of escalating the war in military terms. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson authorized a further 100,000 troops and allocated a further 100,000 for 1966, along with bombing campaigns. Each president inherited what the other had before, and with that the containment policy and the Cold War context, which was misinterpreted that caused more and more escalation, as they each wanted to prove that America was not soft on communism and wanting to solve the Vietnam problem on their own favourable terms. Quagmire theory would be another cause of escalation, as each president, one after the other, succeeded to take further steps to trying to solve the problem. The presidents were all concerned with looking tough on communism for their own domestic audience. The Quagmire theory exhibits how each president became increasingly involved one after the other. As each delved deeper into the Vietnam quagmire, it became harder to get out, as they did not know how to. Each was concerned with wanting to be the one to win Vietnam, which also developed into a stalemate theory. No president wanting to be the first to pull out and admit defeat, prosecuting the war harder in order to win and find a solution. Leading on to the next point of immense domestic pressures faced by each of the presidents, as they had to prove they were not soft on communism. It is arguable that more were concerned with their reputations than securing a second term of presidency, which subsequently led to further escalation. Each president in time served would face immense domestic pressure that challenged each of their communist beliefs and contributed to the decisions made in the Vietnam War. Anti-communist hysteria first arose when Truman, a Democrat, had lost China to communism in 1949. This caused a stir, particularly under the Republicans, who had been out of power for 17 years, and led to the serious accusations made by Senator McCarthy and the subsequent Red Scare. Truman wanted to appear tough on communism and so took the decision to first support the French against the Viet Minh, who he perceived as the greater threat, all Moscow and being the puppets of Stalin. He could not stand to lose another country to communism and had to show that America was not soft on communism. Johnson was also a president who faced immense domestic pressure and was accused of being soft on communism by Barry Goldwater. As a Republican, he had to reassert his anti-communist power over the rule by the Soviets. Johnson firmly believed that the US fought for freedom as well as US security in 2 world wars, as well as Korea and ongoing in Vietnam. He too misinterpreted the war. He famously quoted, "If you let a bully come into your yard one day, the next day he'll be on your porch, and the day after that he'll rape your wife in your own bed." By July 1964, 200 American troops had died in Vietnam, and Johnson had added another 2,500 men to the US forces there. He too had increased the US troops on the ground, with extensive bombing and napalm being used. Millions of Vietnamese had lost their lives in cold-blooded war terms due to Johnson's increased escalation in reaffirming the US's dominant position on the world stage and standing up to the Soviets, the bullies as he put them. Johnson believed it to be a national honour to continue the US commitment to Southeast Asia, adopted by his predecessor Kennedy, and he was determined to stand by all Kennedy had done, which links to the next point of Kennedy's assassination leading to further involvement in the Vietnam War. The least important factor, but still vital in leading to the US escalation, was the assassination of Kennedy. This was largely the stimulus for Johnson's further involvement, as he vowed, "I swore to myself I would carry on." 2 days after the assassination, he told an ambassador that he would not lose Vietnam, which was essentially the Vietnam quagmire he could not afford to lose. He was adamant in continuing Kennedy's strong policies of containment and believed in Domino Theory. Therefore, the congressional advisers remained the same. That also meant that there were now no new ideas brought to the table on how to solve the Vietnam War other than a military one. Johnson was encouraged by his advisers to take up a more forceful approach to the Vietnam conflict and to send in ground troops. The new leader of South Vietnam was General Khan, and he made it clear to Johnson that he did not believe that the South Vietnamese army could withstand the Northern army. Johnson was given the reason he needed in order to carry out bombing raids on North Vietnam. As President and Commander-in-Chief, he would have been seen as a weak leader if he had done nothing to counter this, just as both his joints of chiefs of staff and he himself had bargained on. Congress gave Johnson near total support for his actions and authorized him to take whatever measures he deemed necessary against North Vietnam, based upon the Gulf of Tonkin incident that isn't mentioned here. Congress giving Johnson too much power and latitude had therefore led to the increased escalation after Kennedy's death that provided the clear motivation for Johnson's affirming belief that the increased involvement would solve the Vietnam War. In summation, it is arguable that each president inherited the War of Vietnam in a Cold War context that neither fully understood, facing immense domestic pressures and Congress at times giving the president too much power for a war in the name of containing communism led to cold-blooded deaths of millions. The most important reason being they did not understand the war, and the driving force behind the escalation was containment of communism and domino theory, in fear of losing other countries and a threat to the US security, which would lead to pragmatism as the war inevitably increased further and further quagmire theory.